Hello, class. Welcome to this first of two lectures on Hellenistic and Roman philosophy. Today covering Epicureanism and Stoicism, and next week Cynicism, Skepticism, and the Hellenistic philosophy of religion. What happened next after the grand and in many ways still unsurpassable synthesis that was Aristotle? Well, Greek philosophy continued to flourish during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, roughly 300 BCE to 30 BCE, being the Hellenistic period, and 30 BCE to 300 CE, the Roman. And it also continued during late antiquity, from 300 to 700 CE. Thanks to Alexander's extraordinary expedition, which spread Greek influence from Egypt to Samarkand and Tashkent and as far as the Indus, a new period in world history was inaugurated. Decline of imperial Athens begins around 404 BCE, with the rise of Macedonian Empire shortly after. King Philip of Macedon dying in 336 BCE, Alexander enjoying a brief but illustrious reign of about 13 years. Interestingly, Aristotle himself dies only a year before Alexander. Major centers of the Hellenic Empire include Alexandria in Egypt, Pella in Macedon, Antioch in Syria, Pergamon and Bactriana further east. And this period involved a fusion of different peoples and cultures, that is, an era of increasing cosmopolitanism. Stoicism and Epicureanism became especially popular, but so were the mystery religions. The end of the Hellenistic age and the emergence of the Roman is often dated to when Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, committed suicide after the victory of the Romans at Actium and the future Emperor Augustus. The early Roman Empire can thus be dated from about 30 BCE to 180 CE, the collapse of the Roman Republic, happening shortly after the reign of Marcus Aurelius, 133 to 230, with its ongoing survival in diminished form up until around 509 CE. The Hellenistic period of Greek philosophy has often been presented as a phase of decadence in Greek civilization, which was supposedly bastardized by contact with the Orient. And many prejudices exist among the modern scholars, such as one, only archaic to classical culture, i.e. Plato, Aristotle, is worth studying. 2, the Hellenistic era marked the end of political liberty and the extinguishing of the Greek city-states. And 3, that philosophy declined and abandoned the great speculative effort of Plato and Aristotle. All these prejudices are untrue. In fact, cities continued to engage in intense cultural, political, religious, and even athletic activity, both under the Hellenistic monarchies and later under the Roman Empire. Moreover, technology and exact sciences expanded enormously during this period. The Library of Alexandria gathered together the entire corpus of philosophical and scientific literature and provided a fertile environment for great scholars, such as the physician Herodotus and the astronomer Aristarchus of Samos, likely the first to prove heliocentrism. It is also enough to cite the name of Archimedes of Syracuse, mathematician and engineer, in order to glimpse the extraordinary scientific activity which developed throughout this period. Continuing with Hadot, neither did the city's purported loss of freedom cause a decline in philosophical activity. Besides, can we really say that the democratic regime had been more favorable to philosophy? Wasn't it democratic Athens that prosecuted Anaxagoras and Socrates for impiety? It is often claimed that in the face of their inability to act within the city, the philosophers of the Hellenistic period developed an ethics of the individual and advocated interiority. Things, however, are rather more complex. Like in Plato and Aristotle, when the philosopher realizes that he is completely incapable of helping to remedy the corruption of the city, what can he do except practice philosophy, either alone or with others? The situation of philosophy throughout this period is well summed up by the emperor and Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, when he as well expressed the feeling of impotence in the face of his subjects' inertia and lack of understanding. Philosophers from all the major schools were involved in intensive political activity during this time, often serving as royal counselors or ambassadors for cities, as is shown by inscriptions often erected in their honor. In several instances, Stoic philosophers were actually more successful than Plato in instituting social and political reforms, but these were the exceptions. In general, philosophers during this period never renounced their hope of changing society, even if only by the example of their lives. And indeed, philosophical life was extremely rich and diverse in the Hellenistic period. Alas, we know it only imperfectly. Since most of their writings have been lost, Hadot notes we would indeed have a completely different idea of the philosophical works and of the history of philosophy if more works from this period had been preserved for us. Alas, in the course of the centuries, much of this precious material was lost, particularly at Athens during Sulla's sack of the city in March 86 BCE. but also at Alexandria during successful destructions of the library. Thousands of works disappeared in this way, and other cataclysms put an end to the Hellenistic period and annihilated its treasuries of poetry and art, much of which we know only because of copies made of them by the Romans. For example, the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus wrote at least 700 treatises, but not one has been preserved, and only a few fragments have come down to us. And in this way, our image of the history of philosophy has been irredeemably falsified by the contingencies of history. If the work of Plato and Aristotle had disappeared and those of the Stoics Zeno and Chrysippus preserved, we would have a wholly different view of everything. On the question of Oriental influence during the Hellenistic period, Hadot asks, did Alexander's exposition have an influence on the evolution of Greek philosophy? Not exactly. It certainly benefited scientific and technical development thanks to geographic and ethnographic observations. And it also brought about meetings between Greek and Hindu sages. In particular, a philosopher of the Abderan school named Anaxarchus, together with his student Pyrrho of Elis, founder of Pyrrhonian skepticism, in fact accompanied Alexander as far as India. Pyrrho supposedly living in a retreat from the world ever after because he had heard an Indian tell Anaxarchus that as a result of frequenting royal courts, he was incapable of teaching. We have these tantalizing biographical anecdotes, but no evidence of real exchange or confrontations of theories, or at least no obvious trace of any. At best, we can speak of possible Oriental influence on the Cynics and the Skeptics. They have in part adopted the Indian doctrine of Maya, the idea that the world is no more real than a stage set in which images appear to dreamers or madmen. This might have reflected Oriental influence, but could also have derived from Democritus or Diogenes of Sinope. More solidly, we know that the Greeks in their expeditions further east admired what they called the gymnosophists, or naked sages. In them they found the impression of finding the same way of life they themselves recommended, a life free of convention, in accordance with pure nature, and completely indifferent to what other people considered desirable or undesirable, good or bad. That is a life which led to perfect inner peace and lack of worries. Ataraxia, or freedom from disturbance, being here the goal of the good life and the unanimous aim of all the Hellenistic schools, despite all their particular differences in how to attain it. So, in short, Alexander's expedition does not seem to have provoked much of a stir in the philosophical tradition. In fact, Hellenistic philosophy seems to have developed naturally out of the movements which preceded it. It often revisits pre-Socratic themes and, above all, is marked by the Socratic spirit of inquiry. Although perhaps the encounter between peoples played a role in the development of the idea of cosmopolitanism. Next, Hadot pivots in his chapter on the Hellenistic schools to the philosophical school today, noting that modern students study philosophy because it is a required course. At most, the student may become interested by an initial contact with the discipline and may wish to take exams in the subject. And it is entirely a matter of chance whether a student will encounter a professor who belongs to a particular school, be it phenomenological, existential, deconstructionist, structuralist, or Marxist, etc. Perhaps someday he will pledge intellectual allegiance to one of these isms. His adherence will be wholly intellectual and not engage his way of life, the possible exception, Marxism. For us moderns, in other words, the notion of a philosophical school evokes only the idea of a doctrinal tendency or theoretical position. Things were very different in antiquity, notes Hadot, for no university obligations oriented the future philosopher towards a specific school. Instead, the future philosopher came to attend classes in the school or schole of his choice as a function of the way of life practiced there. Once led into a classroom by chance, however, the student might unexpectedly become converted as he heard the master speak. And this was the story of Polemo, who, after a night of debauchery, entered Xenocrates' school one morning on a dare with a band of drunken comrades. Seduced by the master's discourse, Polemo decided to become a philosopher and eventually head of the school. While this sounds like an edifying fiction, it's completely believable, according to Hadot. Hellenistic and Roman philosophy are defined by four main philosophical schools, all founded in Athens and all in activity for over 300 years. These are Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, Epicurus' Garden, and Zeno's Stoia. The various heads of these schools succeeded their founders and were chosen most often by vote of the members of the school, or designated by their immediate predecessors. And these heads became executors and owners, books and real estate being considered the property of the head of the school. And this because the Athenians had no special legal provisions for educational institutions. Usually, these schools were located in multi-use facilities called gymnasiums. How did the schools support themselves? Given especially that they were open to the public and that most philosophers, but not all, took pride in teaching without a salary. Financial resources were either personal or else provided by benefactors, and the needs of the school were most often covered by a daily fee of 2 obols, which was the wage of a slave who worked by day, as Menander said, barely enough to pay for a cup of tea. There were auditors who paid the fees, and companions or juniors and seniors who lived sometime with the master in his house or nearby. Possess fewer details on the Stoic school, founded around 300 BCE by Zeno of Citium, who taught in the portico called the Stoia Poikile. Stoic scholastic institutions seem to have been less monolithic than the Epicurean school, the places of instruction varying and different doctrinal tendencies coming to surface after Zeno's death. On many points, subsequent heads of the Stoic school professed differing opinions, and these oppositions between tendencies were to continue throughout the duration of the Stoic school, that is up until the 2nd and 3rd century CE. Very few details on the atmosphere which prevailed in these Stoic schools, but we do know that although many schools were founded in other cities than Athens, it was the Athenian ones that were considered the most prestigious throughout the Hellenistic world. And in this way, Athens is the university town of all time. Are there skeptic and cynic schools? Not exactly, no. There were founders here and disciples. The lack of scholastic organization and clear dogma come under the influence of the cynics or the skeptics meant in the first instance to practice a way of life, either that first proposed by Pyrrho or later by Diogenes the Cynic. In another sense, there were indeed skeptic and cynic schools. In the words of the skeptic physician Sextus Empiricus, who we'll study next week, if it is said that a school, hieresis, is the adhesion to numerous dogmas which are mutually coherent, we will say that the skeptic has no school. If, however, it is said that the school is a way of life which follows a specific rational principle in conformity with what appears to us, then we say he has a school. The skeptics taught suspension of judgment and refusal of dogma as the key to peace of mind, and they held arguments and likely gave some instruction, whereas the cynics did not argue and gave no instruction. It was their very life that bore meaning in itself and implied an entire doctrine. More on the skeptics and cynics next week. Let's talk now about Epicurus and Epicureanism. It was in 306 BCE that Epicurus founded a school in Athens, which remained alive in that city until the 2nd century CE. Epicurus is best known as the founder of hedonism, that is the doctrine that the highest goal of life is happiness and it's attained through moderate pleasures and the avoidance of pain. Advocates pleasure as the supreme good, that death is not to be feared, that atomism is the correct metaphysical view, and Epicurus himself seems to have been an incredibly charismatic and respected founder and to have inspired an almost missionary fervor in his disciples through the generations. Note, he was born too late to have ever really encountered Plato, although he may have known Aristotle and is thought to have received instruction at some point at either Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, or both. Nietzsche sometimes quips that Epicurus' will to found a garden school of his own, to prodigiously produce hundreds of texts, was a kind of schadenfreude against Plato or Aristotle, and the desire to set ethical doctrine upon completely other principles, those of the Platonic or Aristotelian systems. We'll find as we study Epicurus' physical and ethical doctrines frequent influence on Plato and Aristotle, but always different intention than theirs in the Ionian tradition of atomism, that is, in Democritus and Leucippus. As Hadot writes, Epicureanism originated in an experience and a choice, and the experience was that of the flesh. The voice of the flesh, not to be hungry, not to be thirsty, not to be cold. He who possesses this state hopes to possess it in the future and can rival Zeus for happiness. The flesh here is, of course, an anatomical part of the body, but in a sense which is phenomenological and apparently wholly new in philosophy. Flesh is the subject of pleasure and pain, or the individual. What is most important is to deliver the flesh from its suffering and thus allow it to experience pleasure. For Epicurus, the Socratic and Platonic choice in favor of love of the good is an illusion. In reality, individuals are moved only by their search to gratify their own pleasures and interests. The Master himself wrote in a letter, "Pleasure is the beginning and the end of the blessed life. We recognize pleasure as the first and natural good, Starting from pleasure, we accept or reject. When we return to this as we judge every good thing, trusting this feeling of pleasure as our guide. According to Hadot, in the Epicurean school, the technical exercise of dialectics played no role. Here, philosophical discourse took on a resolutely deductive form. It started out from principles and went as far as the consequences of those principles. As we can see, for instance, in the letter to Herodotus, which we'll give a very close reading of in just a minute. Some of these discourses were made available in written form to the disciple so that he could learn them by heart. Epicurean instruction began with the reading and the memorization of short summaries of Epicurean doctrine, presented in the form of very brief sayings. The student then came to be familiar with the more developed summaries, like the letter to Herodotus, and finally, if he so desired, he could tackle Epicurus's great work on nature in 37 books. This more in-depth study was not, however, always necessary and certainly not the core of the school. The disciple had always to return to the summaries to avoid becoming lost in details, and had to keep a sense of the whole, that is, his life, constantly in mind. It was thus a give and take between the expansion of knowledge and concentration on the essential nucleus. Goal of life, Epicurus himself writes, do not think that knowledge about the things above the earth, whether treated as part of a philosophical system or by itself, has any other purpose than peace of mind and confidence. Happiness equals ataraxia, freedom from disturbance, and through philosophy we can attain it regardless of our age or personal history. In this way, philosophy becomes, in Epicurus, a kind of therapy of the soul. The mission of philosophy and of Epicurus was above all therapeutic. The philosopher must tend to the sicknesses of the soul and teach mankind how to experience pleasure. This fundamental choice was justified in the first instance by a theoretical discourse on ethics, which aimed to set forth a definition of genuine pleasure as well as an ascetics of desire. And there is here some influence from Plato and Aristotle. For example, when Epicurus teaches that there are sweet and flattering pleasures which are found in motion. However, people who seek only such pleasures will find dissatisfaction and pain because such pleasures are insatiable, and when they reach a certain level of intensity, they become suffering once again. This sounds very much like the discourse on pleasure and ethics in Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics studied previously in this course. The Epicurean ethical project can thus be seen, like Plato's and Aristotle's ethics, as attempting to awaken the Greeks from their predilection for partying, which is a soul-destructive pleasure. Epicurus' own words in the letter to Menoeceus, when we say that pleasure is the end, we do not mean the pleasure of the profligate and that which depends on physical enjoyment, but by pleasure we mean the state wherein the body is free from pain and the mind from anxiety. Neither continual drinking and dancing, nor sexual love, nor the enjoyment of fish, i.e. relishes, opson, and whatever else the luxurious table offers, brings about the pleasant life. Rather, it is produced by the reason which is sober, which examines the motive for every choice and rejection, and which drives away all those opinions through which the greatest tumult lays hold of the mind. Epicurus is perhaps most famous for introducing his doctrine of kinetic versus static pleasure. Kinetic pleasures are mobile and must be strictly distinguished from stable pleasures, as only these latter repose in a state of equilibrium. Static pleasures bespeak the state of a body that is appeased and free of suffering, and consists not in being hungry, not being thirsty, and not being cold. For Epicurus, we do what we do in order to avoid suffering and fear. And when once we have succeeded in this, the tempest of the soul is entirely dissipated, for the living being now no longer needs to move towards anything as if he lacked it, or to seek something else by which the good of the soul and the body might be achieved. For we have need of pleasure precisely when we are suffering from the absence of pleasure. When we are not suffering from this lack, we do not need pleasure. From this perspective, pleasure as the suppression of suffering is the absolute good. And static pleasures are to dynamic or kinetic pleasures as being is to becoming, as the determinate is to the indeterminate and the infinite, as rest is to movement, and as the supertemporal is to what is temporal. State of static pleasure, Hadot, is not unlike, according to Hadot, that sufficient, perfect, and full happiness of which Rousseau speaks, is reveries of a solitary walker. As Rousseau writes, what does one enjoy in such a situation? Nothing external to oneself, nothing except oneself and one's own existence. So long as this state lasts, one is sufficient unto oneself, like God. This state of stable pleasure corresponds to a state of peace of mind and absence of worry. The method for achieving this stable pleasure consists in the ascesis of desire. That is, its suppression, control, and moderation. The reason people are unhappy is that they are tortured by immense and hollow desires, such as those for wealth, luxury, or domination. It is wisdom, however, which must distinguish among the desires. And here Epicurus introduces a tripartite distinction among the pleasures. There are those which are natural and necessary, those which are natural but not necessary, and then empty desires which are neither natural nor necessary. This distinction was already outlined in Plato's Republic. Natural but not necessary pleasures including luxuries, merely natural but not necessary including sex, the only pleasures we really need for happiness being food, drink, and shelter. Beyond this, there are those pleasures simply for ease or for life, such as a bed or friendship. Epicurus' philosophy of pleasure can be seen as a rejoinder to Mark Twain's "A human being has a natural desire to have more of a good thing than he needs." If we are able to train ourselves out of this attitude, then we will be able to say with Epicurus, "Thanks be to blessed nature, who has made necessary things easy to obtain, and who has made things difficult to obtain unnecessary." Turning now to Epicurus' physical doctrines in his Canonics, Hadot begins by noting, "The presentation of a physics is necessary for Epicurus only because a grave threat impairs human happiness. Can pleasure be perfect if it is disturbed by the fear of death and by divine decisions in this world and the next?" It was in order to free people from these terrors that Epicurus proposed his theoretical discourse on physics. Above all, we must not imagine Epicurean physics as a scientific theory intended to reply to objective, disinterested questions, and all the ancients knew that the Epicureans were hostile to the idea of a science studied for its own sake. Philosophical theory is here only a means to express and acquire the consequences of the original choice of life. It is a means of obtaining peace of mind and pure pleasure, and Epicurus never tires of repeating this. He writes, "If we were not disturbed by our worries about celestial phenomena and death, fearing because of our ignorance of the limits of pain and desire, mistaken that these phenomena contain something dire in store for us, we would have no need of the study of nature, phusis. However, we cannot free ourselves of fear about the most essential things if we do not know exactly what the nature of the universe is. We only find some hint of truth in the traditional mythological stories, and so we need the study of nature in order to obtain pleasure in its state of purity in this life. And lastly, there is no profit to be derived from the knowledge of celestial phenomena other than peace of mind and firm reassurance, just as this is the goal of all other research." Let's turn now to a more in-depth reading of the letter to Herodotus. Epicurus begins this letter with a reference to his principal doctrines for those who are unable or unwilling to deal with longer treatises. He begins here his discourse on physics with the Eleatic idea that nothing comes into being from what is not, and follows this up with a statement of fatalism. The totality of things was always such as it is now and always will be, since there is nothing into which it changes, and since beside the totality there is nothing which could pass into it and produce the change. What is, now, in the past, and in the future, the same. Sounding a bit here like Menoeceus. However, what this totality of things that we call nature really is, now turning to Democritus or Leucippus, is nothing other than bodies and the void. Beyond these, bodies and the void, nothing can even be thought, either by the imagination or by analogy with what is imagined. What Aristotle called substantial things, primary substances, is nothing other than the accidents and the properties of atoms in the void. Next, of bodies, some are compounds and others the constituents of these compounds. Constituents are atomic, uncuttable, and unalterable, and these are the primary entities that exist. Why? Otherwise, if there were no atoms, then what is would be dissolved into the non-existent. The atoms are what is full in nature, incapable of dissolution at any point of themselves and in any way. Next, according to Epicurus' physics, the totality of things is infinite. For that which is finite has an extremity, and that which has an extremity is always viewed next to something else. Not having a limit is literally being infinite. Such is nature, nature being nothing other than the atoms and the void, themselves infinite. Additionally, the totality of things is infinite both in the numbers of bodies and in the magnitude of the void. There are both infinite atoms and an infinite void. For if the void were infinite, but the bodies finite, the bodies would not remain anywhere, but would be traveling scattered all over the infinite void, for lack of the bodies which support and marshal them by buffering. It's becoming a pretty impressive argument. Cannot posit infinite void and finite atoms, then there would be no atomic cohesion, the support and marshalling of bodies by buffering. Next, if the void were finite, that there were infinite atomic bodies, they wouldn't have anywhere to be. We might say, in opposition to this, that both atoms and the void are finite, and at least that would be a coherent position. Then we'd be thrown back. The idea of what is finite is always limited with respect to something else. So Epicurus' first a priori arguments here do have a kind of validity and coherence. Next, he argues that unimaginably many atomic shapes there are, and hence also infinite atoms. The atoms move continuously forever, some separating at a great distance from each other, others keeping up their vibration on the spot whenever they happen to get trapped by their interlinking or imprisoned by atoms which link up. Wow, this sounds more or less exactly like the worldview of modern atomic physics. It seems to us somewhat miraculous. Epicurus would have already defined these basic concepts of the atomic universe, such as interlinking, buffering, separation at a great distance, vibration on the spot. Indeed, it almost looks like modern physics has proven Epicurus to be correct. This in itself might be a powerful argument for rationalism, which is particularly ironic in this case, as Epicurus considered his physical doctrines only to emerge from and to serve the natural necessities of life, i.e. not even as a strictly objective scientific theory. Turns out it kind of was. Next he writes, "For the nature of the void brings this about by separating each atom off by itself, since it is unable to lend them any support, and their own solidity causes them as a result of their knocking together to vibrate back, at whatever distance their interlinking allows them to recoil from the knock." Double or even triple wow here. This is again almost exactly how modern physics understands the atomic universe. And next, there is no beginning to this because atoms and the void are eternal. Next, Epicurus argues that sensation is the result of effluences, that is, the shapes of solid bodies, concavity, fineness of texture, from the atomic universe. The body being composed of atoms and the voids, nevertheless cast off effluences, might say now photonic energy, like particles or waves. These delineations emitted by atomic bodies we call images. There's a lack of obstruction from colliding bodies which make motion through the void achieve any imaginable distance in an unimaginable time. It seems to be a proto-version of the modern Newtonian theory of inertia. Bodies will continue at whatever velocity they travel if unimpeded by other bodies. And it also, coming up as it does in the context of this theory of images or effluences, seems to be a proto-form, proto-explanation of how light arrives at us from distant stars. Photonic particles or waves being particularly unimpeded and thus traveling unimaginable distances in unimaginable times. Speaking of the atoms themselves or their effluences, the principles are the same, and slow and fast are relative to collision and non-collision in the atomic universe. Indeed, the images have unsurpassed speed because they suffer no or few collisions. However, here coming out against quantum mechanics, thousands of years before it was even formulated, Epicurus writes, "No moving body reaches a plurality of places simultaneously. Creation of images happens as fast as thought, for there is a continuous flow from the surface of bodies." The astonishingly lucid, complex, and as it turns out, visionary truth of this Epicurean science of nature just gets more and more incredible as the letter proceeds. We call objects or collections of atomic bodies, their cohesion being a function of uniform bombardment resulting from the vibrations of the atoms deep in the solid body. All our impressions are produced through the image's concentrated succession or after effect. Regards to these sensations or impressions, themselves ongoing effluences from atomic bodies, falsehood and error are always only located in the opinions that we add. Epicurus here sounding like a proto-empiricist. All our knowledge is based on sensory recognition, appropriate to its source, and is grounded epistemologically by co-affection. As our constitution is related to by co-affection that of the atomic bodies, lest we would perceive no effluences at all. There must be something in us co-affective with them. All our senses register this co-affection, and some produce sensations that are harmonious and welcome, others that are disharmonious and unwelcome, such as the smell of a rose. This is our aversion to manure. The size of the atoms, there is variation, but not an infinite variation. A Remember earlier he had said there might be infinite variation in shape, but not in size. Why? Because we don't need to posit an infinite variation of size to explain the differences of qualities that we observe. Probably do need, according to Epicurus, infinite shape. It turns out we need neither infinite shape nor infinite size in the atomic universe to explain all the appearances we see. It's still incredible that Epicurus was raising these questions 2,300 years ago. Nor do the atoms contain an infinite number of bits with no limit to smaller sizes. The most basic atomic elements are thus quanta, i.e. there is a minimum in the atom and the rest are compounds. And then he gives a long argument for this. Astonishingly ahead of his time insights, Epicurus notes that up and down do not really exist, for there is an infinity in every direction, no center, that atoms, regardless of size, move through the void at equal velocity, as fast as thought, but only insofar as nothing collides with them. Sounds like a principle that could have been formulated by a Big Bang theorist. On the soul, he writes, it is a fine structured body, diffused throughout the whole aggregate, most strongly resembling wind, with a certain blending of heat or fire. The soul has a much finer structure, however, which makes it more liable to co-affection with the rest of the aggregate. Just as our bodies are collections of atoms, consciousness, sensation, intelligence, or soul is an aggregate of finer atoms. As atoms more related to phenomena of wind or air, of air or fire, other than, say, earth or water. It is this finer constitution which makes the soul atoms more liable to co-affection with other things, i.e. they're more sensstrument instruments. And all this is shown by the soul's powers, feelings, mobilities, and thought processes, and by those features of it whose loss marks our death. The soul has a major share of responsibility for sensation, and it grants to the body a kind of accidental attribute. For example, when I intend to say hi with my hand, greeting accidentally inheres in the hand. This is an accidental attribute imbued to the body part on account of the soul. Next, the soul does not exist separate from the body, but is the finest part of the body owing to its contiguity and co-affection with all of the atomic signatures within a body. Soul, consisting of subtle atoms, is thus the most subtle part of what we are. Like in Aristotle, still the ground of being of the living being. Next, Epicurus notes that the soul will survive and sense so long as the body does and is in good condition. Furthermore, there are specific, probably very large number and type of atoms that are needed to make up the nature of a soul. When the whole aggregate disintegrates, the soul is dispersed and no longer has power or motion. Next, Epicurus explicitly takes aim at Aristotle, Plato, and all the pre-Socratic philosophers pretty much, except for the atomists when he says that the term incorporeal cannot be applied to the soul, for there is no incorporeal per se except as the void, not even in thought. So Epicurus decisively rejects dualism. It is not the case that the body is extended substance, whereas the soul is a thinking substance, as in Descartes, and more incorporeal. Rather, all of thought is corporeal. Is corporality of a different type. As Epicurus says explicitly, those who say the soul is incorporeal are talking nonsense. If it were like that, it would be unable to act or be acted upon in any way, whereas as a matter of fact, both these accidental properties are self-evidently discriminable in the soul. Nor are there per se substances, sorry Aristotle. Rather, there are only bodies as aggregates, and accordingly, there is a complex conception of the soul involving both rougher and finer atomic elements. Continuing to take issue with Aristotle, Epicurus writes, by attributes and by accidents, all we mean are the sensible concomitants of a given body, i.e. a given collection of atoms. Individual things get their name through a certain way of being focused on in concomitance with the complex, i.e. our language and what we designate with it are patterns of coherence. Individual primary substances can share names such as genera or species, as well as accidents, because of a certain pattern of coherence, a pattern of concomitance and complexity. For Epicurus, the Aristotelian attributes are the permanent concomitants, Socrates being a man, for example, whereas the accidents are the impermanent concomitants, Socrates having a beard. Epicurus is clear that attributes and accidents are never per se entities, radicalizing Aristotle's principle that secondary substances have no independent existence. They are always viewed in just the way that sensation itself individualizes them. Here, Epicurus more completely evacuates Plato's invisible world and doctrine of the forms than did Aristotle. Next, we hear that time is relative and that long time and short time is only ever grasped by analogy. Furthermore, time is the mode in which we conceive of everything: day and night, presence or absence of feelings, accidents and attributes, i.e., there is no possible experience for us independently of time, which always takes the form for us of a duration relative to a perspective. All the worlds and every limited thing we see has come into being from the infinite. Each thing has separated off from the whole through individual entanglements, but all atomic complexes will at some time in the future disaggregate, sooner or later. Epicurus concludes the letter to Herodotus by returning to the general principles of his philosophy of nature. Even nature is educated and constrained in many different ways by actual states of affairs, i.e., nature learns from nature in longer and shorter perspectival durations. Natural law in this way is contingent to and an emergent property of the system, rather than something we can appeal to in an essentialist mode or as part of the search for principles. Nature learns through interacting with itself, and these lessons of nature were made more accurate and augmented with new discoveries by reason. Reason is a part of nature that augments nature's own self-learning, and hence we get inventiveness and human technology and cultural achievement. The essence of nature being made more accurate and augmented by rational and technological discoveries is a process in Epicurus that happens faster among some people, slower among others, and in some ages and eras, and this is owing to individual needs, greater or smaller leaps in discovery they result in. Next, names did not come into being by coining, but men's natures underwent feelings and received impressions which varied from tribe to tribe, i.e., the cultural systems which each particular people in some locality and region of the earth vary immensely. Each tribe breathes a peculiar breath according to their differences from place to place. Herodotus is here anticipating the very discovery of the science of ecology, noting the differences in our apperception and knowledge of nature, and in our cultural systems which name the beings of nature and the forces which animate them, the gods, are a result of ecological differences, i.e., ultimately traceable back to the atomic complexes. Later on, particular coinings, i.e., nominalisms, were made by consensus within the individual races so that designations would be more concise and less ambiguous. Here we have the first principle of the Epicurean theory of signs, beginning in response to singular existence in particular peoples and places, being generalized to universal meanings through coinings, that is nominalism, this for the sake of conventional utility. And now, nearing the end of the letter to Herodotus, we hear about the gods. Also, the men who shared knowledge introduced certain unseen entities and brought words for them into usage. Hence, some men gave utterance under compulsion, and others chose words rationally, and it is thus, as far as the principle is concerned, that they achieved self-expression. In other words, it is due to our specific enmeshed ecologies. Philosophical thought conceptualizes the invisible principles or unseen entities that guides the world in different ways among different peoples. Here, mythology or religion and philosophical principles themselves being noted in the development from the particular to the general. Knowledge of celestial phenomena was not the result of individuals who were blessed with an imperishable divine knowledge. We should not overly reverence or worship our sages, but always through close observation. Such observation always began not from wonder like in Aristotle's metaphysics, but rather from trouble, concern, anger, and fear. We began to study the whole of nature and to establish correspondences and ordering principles on account of our weakness, fear, and dependence on each other. So the idea that celestial bodies are more blessed and perfect, like in Aristotle's system still, is completely ridiculous for Epicurus. Here, our very language misleads us. We associate majesty with the names we give for things and continue to do so when they don't contradict us. We prefer to attribute majesty, holiness, sacredness, supremacy, various experiences, values, or principles by tradition, and we do this even when our traditions are wrong, because very often revaluing our values would lead to conflict and great mental disquiet. What an astonishing thing is Epicurus' letter to Herodotus. One of the biggest upshots of Epicurus' philosophical system for ethics is that we should not fear the afterlife because it doesn't exist, it's a lie. This is very far from modern atheism, however, because in Epicurus there is God and there are gods, but they don't bother with us. It is our false belief about the gods and death that messes us up. and such terror and darkness of the mind should be dispelled with insight into physis and the way things really are. The other biggest upshot for the Epicurean system is that while accepting Democritus's atomism, he adds our free will, explains it as an ultimate result of the swerve or clinamen in the atomic universe. More on that in a minute. Let's look now to the second textbook reading, the letter to Menoeceus. This letter begins, again partially in contradiction to Aristotle, that wisdom should be sought both when we are young and in old age, for the health of the soul always matters. The season for studying philosophy and attaining happiness is always now. When we study philosophy when we are old, we become young again. When the young study philosophy, they pre-glimpse the happiness of old age. We must always exercise ourselves in philosophy because it is what brings happiness, and it guides all our actions towards happiness's attainment. Here, the letter to Menoeceus begins, perhaps paradoxically for us, by rehearsing the basics of Epicurean theology. This is not tongue-in-cheek, but rather right life really begins for Epicurus with first the belief that God is a living being, immortal and blessed. That we can never wholly break with the notion of God that is indicated by the common sense of mankind. However, we should never accord ourselves with the supposed traditional pieties, as these are most often gross impieties. Rather, in assenting to the God of common sense, the living being, immortal and blessed, we should understand this deity aright and anew, without admixture, the errors of superstition, and a merely inherited religious ritual. This will indeed separate the Epicurean theological position from the Stoic, which advocates more religious piety and worship, as we'll learn more soon. Epicurus, the truly impious person, is the one who merely follows traditional religious prejudices and false assumptions. Next, having established the one deity, the model to aspire to, its happiness and self-perfected tranquility, we must next accompany ourselves to belief that death is nothing for us, for good and evil imply sentience, and death is the privation of all sentience. Death is nothing to us, for good and evil, which we attribute, say, to life and death, imply sentience, but death is the privation of all sentience. Rightly understanding death as nothing makes the mortality of life enjoyable. Nothing added, nothing taken away. Yes, life can be terrible and tragic, but it's really not that bad, and there is also no terror in ceasing to live. Fear of death often causes greater pain than the pains in life themselves, but it is only a prospect and nothing real. Most famously, when we are, death is not come, and when death is come, we are not. Death is thus nothing both to the living and to the dead, and death can even be a good respite if the evils of life become unbearable. The young should be taught to live well and to die well, and the teaching of pessimism or the wisdom of the Silenus, uttered by Socrates in the Phaedo, that it is better not to be born or to die soon, is not for the living who never actually believed this. As to the future, it's neither wholly ours nor wholly not ours, so we should not count it as quite certain, nor despair of it as wholly uncertain. Rather, we should focus on this life, the natural and the necessary desires that must be satisfied for happiness, such as the health of the body, tranquility of the mind, which is the sum and end of the blessed life. For in being free from pain and fear, again, the tempest of the soul is quelled. Then nothing is lacking, and the good of the soul and the body is fulfilled. Also, in the letter to Menoeceus, pleasure is our first and kindred good. It is the starting point of every choice and every aversion, and to it we come back inasmuch as we make feeling the rule by which to judge every good thing. We do not choose every pleasure whatsoever, but pass over those that cause a greater annoyance than they are worth. We sometimes even consider pains superior if, as a consequence, they bring greater pleasure. We should not shun all pain. All pleasures are naturally akin to the good, but not all pleasures are choice-worthy, just as all pain is an evil, and yet not all pain is to be shunned. Here we must learn to measure the conveniences and the inconveniences entailed by our lives of pleasure and pain. This is the principle of judgment in ethics. It will, of course, eventually give rise to the utilitarian theory of John Stuart Mill. When we say, then, that pleasure is the end and aim, we do not mean the pleasures of the prodigal or the pleasures of sensuality, as we are understood to do by some through ignorance, prejudice, or willful misrepresentation. Epicurus here, being keenly aware of the lies circulating about his doctrine, would of course continue for centuries after his death, even into our modern usage of the word Epicurean, to describe the aesthetic type devoted to the pleasures of the sensual. Poor Epicurus, given that our ignorance, prejudice, and willful misrepresentation of him has continued unabated for thousands of years. Speaking very clearly against this prejudice, he writes, "By pleasure we mean the absence of pain in the body and of trouble in the soul, i.e., not an unbroken succession of drinking bouts, revelry, and sex, nor the enjoyment of relicious fish and other delicacies, as we read earlier. It is sober reasoning which produces the most pleasant life, and banishing those beliefs and habits through which the soul is put into a tumult. Of all this, the beginning and the greatest good is prudence, phronesis," again indicating a debt to Aristotle. Prudence is a more precious thing even than philosophy in Epicurus, reversing Aristotle's priority of the theoretical life. From prudence springs all the other virtues, for it teaches that we cannot lead a life of pleasure which is not also a life of prudence, honor, and justice. Despite all his differences, Epicurus is still very much rooted in Platonic Aristotelian ethics here. In turn, the life of prudence, honor, and justice is the truly pleasurable life, for the virtues have grown into one with the pleasant life, and a pleasant life is inseparable from them. The superior man and judge holds a holy belief concerning the gods, is altogether free of the fear of death, diligently considers the ends fixed by nature, and understands how easily the limit of good things can be reached, and how the duration and intensity of evils is but slight in comparison. On destiny, he writes, "It is not that which is sovereign over all things," here pre-refuting the Stoics, who he laughs at and scorns on this account, "but rather some things happen of necessity, and others of chance, and others through our own agency, and we shouldn't mix these three things up." What a very helpful therapeutic principle for life. Determinism versus free will, he writes, "Complete necessity destroys responsibility, and chance or fortune are in fact inconstant. It is only our actions which are free, and to which praise and blame can be attached." And here even the old myths, upon which Epicurus still rests his theological principles, understand better than some pre-Socratics. For at least the old religion held out faint hope for our salvation if we honor the gods, whereas the natural philosophers, or most of them, reduce all things to necessity. "Exercise thyself in these and kindred precepts day and night, both by thyself and with him who is like unto thee, then never either in waking or dream wilt thou be disturbed, but wilt live as a god among men. For man loses all semblance of mortality by living in the midst of immortal blessings." We're going to have a chance to learn more about Epicurean theology and what role exactly as models to aspire to God and the gods play when we look to Cicero's dialogue on the nature of the gods next week. On justice and friendship, Epicurus teaches that justice is nomos, law, convention, ordering song of the ancestors, in the broadest sense, the shared way in which we pursue the best possible life. This leads to, and Epicurus' hope is the garden community in which friendship will dance through the world, bidding us to waken to the recognition of happiness. Most of the main maxims covered in his principal doctrines, thought to be the core exoteric aspect of his ethical teaching, we've already covered in outline above, but some, especially the later ones, contribute significantly to our understanding of Epicurus' political thought. We'll just cover those ones here. He writes, "When tolerable security against our fellow men is attained, then on a basis of power sufficient to afford support and material prosperity, arises in most genuine form the security of a private life withdrawn from the multitude." This already sounds like a proto-version of what we know as the social contract theory, and indeed it is, as we'll hear in the subsequent sayings. Saying 31, "Natural justice is a symbol or expediency to prevent one man from harming or being harmed by another. Those animals which are incapable of making covenants with one another to the end that they may neither inflict nor suffer harm are without justice or injustice. And so animals incapable of making covenants with one another are without justice or injustice. And so also are some tribes of humans who are incapable of forming mutual covenants. Covenant is for the sake of the preservation of the social body or the living community. There never was an absolute justice, but only an agreement made in reciprocal intercourse, agreements whose purpose is to provision against the infliction and the suffering of harm. It is impossible for a man who secretly violates any article of the social compact to feel confident that he will remain undiscovered, even if he has already escaped 10,000 times, for right on to the end of his life, he is never sure he will not be detected. Taken generally, justice is the same for all, to wit, something found expedient in mutual intercourse. But in its application to particular cases of locality or conditions of whatever kind, it varies under different circumstances. And so accounting for these circumstances, laws are only just in virtue of their expediency, and situations change. Those who are best able to provide themselves with the means of security against their neighbors, being thus in possession of the surest guarantee, pass the most agreeable life in each other's society, and their enjoyment of the fullest intimacy was such that if one of them died before his time, the survivors did not lament his death as if it called for commiseration. This articulation of the social contract in Epicurus becomes central to the revival of the social contract theory in modern philosophy, thinkers like Rousseau, Hobbes, and Locke, and down from there to the present day. In fact, as we'll see, much of modern philosophy, both in ethics and in physics, and even in political economy, like in Karl Marx, is rooted within a retrieval and reinstatement of various theses within the Epicurean school. Summing up Epicurus' philosophy, Hadot writes that his goal was to suppress our fear of the gods and of death, especially in his letter to Herodotus and to Pythocles. Not studied here, he shows on the one hand that the gods have nothing to do with the creation of the universe and do not care about the conduct of the world or of human beings, and on the other that death is nothing for us. The all has no need to be created by a divine power, for it is eternal. Being can no more come from not being than not being can come from being. This eternal universe is constituted by bodies in space or the void in which they move, and the bodies which we see, the bodies of living beings, but also of the earth and the stars, are made up of indivisible, immutable bodies, infinite in number. These are the atoms which fall at equal speed in a straight line as a result of their weight in an infinite void, which here sounds almost like gravity. They collide and engender composite bodies as soon as they deviate infinitesimally from their trajectory. In this way, bodies in the world are born and also disintegrate as a result of the continuous movement of atoms. In the infinity of time and of the void, there is an infinity of worlds which appear and disappear, and our world is only one among them. Lastly, that the idea of deviation of the atoms has a twofold purpose. On the one hand, it explained the formation of bodies which could not be constituted if the atoms merely fell in a straight line at equal speed. And on the other hand, by introducing chance into necessity, it provided the foundation for human freedom. The next reading we're going to look at this week is Lucretius, De Rerum Natura, or On the Nature of Things. Lucretius being a Roman Epicurean poet who placed the argument of Epicurean philosophy into poetic form as a plea for peace and tranquility in human life. Lucretius brings together the traditional world of poetry, from Homer and Hesiod through Apollonius of Rhodes, author of the Argonautica, Roman poets such as Virgil and Ovid. Within this illustrious tradition situates this massive epic Epicurean poem, instantiating the tradition of philosophers among the pre-Socratics, as we saw, of writing philosophy in the form of poetry, such as Parmenides and Empedocles. Lucretius blends scientific inquiry into the universe with Epicurean ethical theory, Epicurus arguing that understanding the material elements of the universe help us live richer lives. He redefines the objects of human marvel and admiration away from the supernatural and towards the natural. Stop worrying about the gods, he teaches, and look into nature. It is as well in Lucretius we find clear exposition of Epicurus' doctrine of the clinamen, or swerve of the atom, since all of Epicurus' 36 volumes on the physics have been lost. Hadot quotes Lucretius, "If the spirit is not ruled by necessity in all its acts, if it escapes domination and is not reduced to a total passivity, it is because of the slight deviation of the atoms in a place and a time determined by nothing." Commenting, it scarcely need be added that from antiquity right up to the present, this uncaused deviation and abandonment of strict determinism has seemed scandalous to historians of philosophy. And the scandal continues into 20th century philosophy of nature. For example, in Michel Serres' essay Lucretius, Science and Religion, which I've also assigned this week, constitutes a marvelous complete statement, Epicurean philosophy of nature in Lucretius in a modern context. This reading is too complex, nuanced, and marvelous to cover in this video and still have time to work on Stoicism. So here, I'll just gesture you towards it. It's one of the neatest readings in the whole course, and encourage you to read the textbook selection of On the Nature of Things by reading its opening stanza. Lucretius begins, "Through open ears and a sharp mind set free the cares and find the true system of philosophy. that you do not despise and abandon my gifts to you, set out with constant eagerness before they are understood. For I am beginning to set out for you the deepest workings of the heavens and the gods, and to reveal the first beginnings of things, out of which nature creates all things and increases and maintains them, and into which nature dissolves them again once they have perished. These we are accustomed in setting forth our account to call matter and the generating bodies of things, and to name them the seeds of all things, and to use the term first bodies for them. Because all things exist from these first beginnings, it used to be that human life, polluted, was lying about in the dirt before our eyes. Crushed by the weight of religion, stretched out its head on display from the regions of heaven, threatening mortals from above with its horrible-looking face. It was a Greek man who first dared to raise his mortal eyes against religion, who first fought back against it. Neither the stories about the gods, nor thunderbolts, nor the sky, with its threatening rumbles, held him back, provoked all the more the fierce sharpness of his mind, so that he desired to be the first to shatter the imprisoning bolts of the gates of nature. And as a result, the vital force of his mind was victorious, and he traveled far beyond the flaming walls of the world. He trekked through the measureless in mind and spirit. As victor, he brings back from there the knowledge of what can come to be, what cannot, in short, by what process each thing has its power limited and its deep-set boundary stone, and so the tables are turned. Religion lies crushed beneath our feet, and his victory raises us to the sky. I am afraid one thing in all this, that you might think that you are starting on the first steps of an unholy system of thought, and are walking the path of crime. On the contrary, it has happened too often that this so-called religion has produced criminal and unholy actions. Thus was the case at Iolus, when the chosen leader of the Greeks, the first among men, foully defiled the altar of the virgin goddess of the crossroads with the blood of Iphigenia. In other words, false religion results in the greatest evils and misunderstandings of the nature of the cosmos for mankind. As we'll continue to hear, and as we'll hear across Lucretius's marvelous poem, true religion secures and sustains the foundations of peace and happiness in human life. On this topic of Epicurus's God, Hadot writes, he does not imagine divinity as the power of creating, dominating, or imposing one's will upon the less powerful. Instead, it is the perfection of the supreme being, happiness, indestructibility, beauty, pleasure, and tranquility. In representations of the gods, the philosopher finds both the amazed pleasure we may feel when admiring beauty and the comfort that can be provided by contemplating the model of wisdom, i.e. the divine life itself. And from this point of view, Epicurus's gods are the projection and incarnation of the Epicurean ideal of life. The gods spend their lives enjoying their own perfection and the pure pleasure of existing, with no needs and no worries, in the most pleasant company. Their physical beauty is identical to the beauty of the human figure. We might think, not without reason, that such ideal gods are merely representations imagined by human beings and owe their existence only to human beings. But for Epicurus, this is not the case. He seems to conceive them as independent realities who maintain their eternal existence because they know how to ward off what could destroy them and what is alien to them. I recall the twofold constitution of the human being as body and soul, more coarse and finer atomic complexes. Gods as well on this model must be understood as soul, pure and simple, the most free and independent atomic aggregates, the Heraclitean world of ceaseless change and becoming, thus the closest to being as such. The gods are friends of the wise, and the wise are friends of the gods. For the wise, the highest good is to contemplate the splendor of the gods. They have nothing to ask of them, yet they pray to them in prayers of praise. The wise pay homage to and address the gods' perfection. And here the Epicurean relation to the gods is that of pure love, that is a love that demands nothing in return, much like in Aristotle's theology as well. Like the gods, the wise man gazes into the infinity of innumerable worlds, and the closed universe expands into infinity. On exercises in the Epicurean school, Hadot notes that the personality of Epicurus played a role of the first importance. The precedent to be followed: act as though Epicurus were watching you. The Epicureans echoed, "We will obey Epicurus, whose way of life we have chosen." And this is why the Epicureans attached so much importance to portraits of their founder, which figured not only in paintings but also on rings. To his disciples, Epicurus appeared like a god among men. He was the incarnation of wisdom and the model they had to imitate. And his school and legacy has rightly been compared in many respects to Buddhism. All this, however, effort and tension had to be avoided. On the contrary, the Epicureans' fundamental exercise consisted in relaxation, serenity, and the art of enjoying the pleasures of the soul and the stable pleasures of the body. Supreme pleasure to contemplate the infinity of the universe and the majesty of the gods, as well as the pleasure of discussion. Epicurus mentions in one of his last letters sent to Idomeneus, "To these pains I have opposed the joy I feel in my soul when I recall our philosophical conversations." Cicero writes that for Epicurus, nothing is more pleasant or to be desired than friendship. Nor did he merely declare this, he confirmed it in his actions and habits. In Epicurus' one little house, what a troop of friends there was, all gathered together by him. What a conspiracy of love united their feelings. And more so even than in Plato or Aristotle's schools, women and slaves were welcome in Epicurus' garden. Pleasure of a life in common did not disdain to allow slaves and women to participate in it. And this is for Hadot a true revolution, which denoted a complete change in atmosphere compared to the sublimated homosexuality of Plato's school. Women had, in exceptional cases, been admitted to that school. Now, in Epicurus' garden, they are truly a part of the community. Among them were not only married women, like Themista, wife of Laertius, but also courtesans, like Leotion, the lioness, who is portrayed in Meditation by the painter Theodorus. Closing this overview of Epicurus and Epicureanism, Ernest Hoffmann gives an admirable account of the Epicurean choice of life. Existence must, first of all, be considered as pure chance, in order to be lived completely as a unique wonder. We must realize that, inevitably, it occurs only once, and not until then can we celebrate it in its irreplaceability and uniqueness. This emphasis in Epicureanism on the singularity of life, as we'll see, much in contrast to the Stoic doctrine of eternal return, to which we now turn as we introduce Stoicism. So let's talk now about Stoicism. Both Stoicism and Skepticism were in fact offshoots in response to the Platonic Academy. After Plato's death, his successors were Speusippus, Xenocrates, and Polemo, who taught for 40 years. And Polemo trained Arcelius, who founded the school known as the Skeptics. Within the academy itself, basically making the Platonic Academy equivalent to academic skepticism for a time. Polemo also trained Zeno of Citium, who founded a rival school called the Stoics, since he offered his teaching in the Stoia Postile, or painted porch of the Athenian Agora. The older Stoics, that is Zeno's inheritors, Cleanthes and Chrysippus, then the Middle Stoics, Panaetius and Posidonius, and lastly the later Stoics, including Seneca, Musonius Rufus, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Positions in Stoicism did vary a fair bit, and we'll see some of these variations in Diogenes Laertius' summary this week. The basic doctrines were the same. Most basically, human beings should, quote, live in agreement with nature, phusis, i.e. not pleasure. This is not unlike the doctrines of Plato and Aristotle to a large extent, but the Stoic concept of nature was different. The Stoics were materialists who rejected Plato's forms and Aristotle's residual reliance on the incorporeal. That is, they did not see the world in terms of formal and final causes or the categories. Like the Epicureans, for the Stoics, the world consisted of space, time, the void, and the predicables. The predicables are incorporeal but completely dependent on corporeal entities. To become wise for the Stoics meant to comprehend the structure of nature, which is intrinsically rational and meaningful, to live accordingly. And unlike the Epicureans, they were hard determinists, believing in necessity fate as Zeus, the king of the cosmos. Stoic ethics is often understood in terms of the teaching analogy of the dog tied to a wagon. If the wagon moves and the dog follows, he does well, according to nature. If he doesn't, he will be dragged along anyway, and that's not good. Hadot notes we must also talk about experience and choice with regards to Stoicism. Here the choice is fundamentally the same as that made by Socrates, who, in Plato's Apology, declared, "For the good person no evil is possible, whether he is dead or alive. The good person believes that the only evil is moral evil, and that there is no good but moral good, namely what we call duty or virtue. This is the supreme value for which we must not hesitate to face death." And the Stoic choice is thus situated in the direct line of the Socratic choice and diametrically opposed to the Epicurean choice. For the Stoics, happiness consists not in pleasure or in individual interests, but in the demands of the good, which are dictated by reason or nature and transcend the individual. So the Stoic choice is also opposed to the Platonic choice insofar as it holds that happiness, that is, the moral good, is accessible to all, but within this life. For Hadot, the Stoic experience consists in becoming sharply aware of the tragic situation of human beings as conditioned by fate, a necessity which is inexorable and indifferent to our individual interest, breaks our aspirations and our hopes. We are helpless and defenseless in the face of the accidents of life and the setbacks of fortune, illness, and death. Everything in our life escapes us. The result of this being that people are unhappy, mostly because they passionately seek to acquire things which they cannot attain and to flee evils which are inevitable. There is one thing and only one which does depend on us and which nothing can tear away from us. That is the will to do good and to act in conformity with reason or nature. This will to do good is an unbreachable fortress which everyone can construct within themselves. And here rational discourse cannot but be self-coherent, and living according to reason means submitting to this demand for coherence. Zeno defined the Stoic choice of life as follows: to live coherently, that is, according to a rule of life which is unique and harmonious, for those who live in incoherence are unhappy. On Stoic physics, Hadot points out that philosophical discourse about physics in Stoicism aimed to justify the choice of life we have just mentioned, and to make explicit the way of being in the world that is implied. The Epicureans, remember, one teaches physics only so that one can teach the distinction which must be made with regards to goods and evils. For Stoicism as well, physics has an ethical finality, insofar as the rationality of human action is based on the rationality of nature. Just as we will self-coherence, acting in accord with our nature, we will to know the fundamental physical laws operative in material reality, since these increase coherence. For the Stoics, we love our own existence and its laws, just as we love nature's existence and laws. For the world itself is one single living being, in tune with itself and ultimately coherent. On Stoic reason or logos, Hadot underlines, the universe is rational. It is not possible that there could be such exquisite order in ourselves, but that disorder should reign in the all. Living in conformity with reason thus means living in conformity with nature or universal law. And here Stoic reason or logos was identical to Heraclitean fire, i.e. it was totally material and yet not unspiritual. And like in Epicureanism, there is not a superior world that awaits us in death. However, against the consequences of Epicurean physics, in which there is no true unity, that everything happens by chance, merely atomic aggregates undergoing processes of atomic isolation amidst an infinite void and infinite atoms, for the Stoics, everything is within everything else. Bodies are organic wholes, and everything happens by rational necessity, not by chance. Accordingly, within infinite time, there is only one cosmos which repeats itself endlessly. And so note here that the Stoics, as well as the Pythagoreans, posited an eternal return. The Epicureans had believed that the spontaneity of atomic particles could deviate from their trajectory, and this made human freedom possible, as well as our control of our desires. The Stoics based human reason upon nature conceived as universal reason, and this makes evaluating the Stoic doctrine of freedom a bit more complicated. As reason, logos, or fire remains wholly deterministic, a kind of breath or vital heat which mixes itself totally with matter, engendering all beings, and within which everything happens by rigorous necessity. For the Stoic doctrine of human freedom, there are really only two choices. One, live in accordance with this nature and necessity, or two, work against it in our actions or our beliefs. Freedom is thus based in a certain way in Stoicism on our capacity to transgress the limits set by nature, and our only choice is to undo this transgression and live again in accordance with nature. The eternal return is explained as a cosmos in tune with itself and self-coherent, and as a reason which necessarily wills itself to be just what it is, like in the mythical image of the Ouroboros, so much so that it repeats itself in an eternally identical cycle in which fire, as it transforms itself into the other elements, finally returns to itself. We can thus see Stoicism and its reason as a return beyond Plato and Aristotle to Heraclitean becoming and its fire doctrine, and even to a repristinated Heraclitean logos. Stoics also avow the strict principle of causality. There is no movement without a cause, and everything happens by causes or the principle of sufficient reason. These causes are material factors that give rise to the impulses in all things. So everything happens by fate, and the question becomes, what then is human freedom, and how is moral choice even possible? The price to be paid for morality to be possible is freedom of choice. Here, human beings who refuse to accept fate are able to revolt against universal order and act and think against universal reason or against nature. In other words, we're capable of separating ourselves from the universe and becoming strangers and exiles from the great city of the world. Such a refusal, however, changes nothing about the order of the world. As Cleanthes wrote, quoted by Seneca, "The fates guide the person who accepts them and hinders the person who resists them." And so reason includes not only an almost Taoist going with the order of nature, but also all resistance, oppositions, and obstacles. So by this very deviancy, eventually, in given instances, contributing the success of the plan for the world. Stoicism can thus be a major source, Christian theology, and the theodicy of evil in later authors. As we'll see, Stoicism ending up having a far more powerful influence on early Christian philosophy than did Epicureanism. The answer to the question of how human freedom is even possible, a world that is strictly fatalistic, the answer is that the form of reason proper to human beings is not universal reason, the substantial formative reason which is immediately immanent within things. Instead, it is discursive reason which has the power in judgments and in discourses it enunciates to give meaning to the events which fate imposes upon us and the actions which they produce. And so human passions as well as morality are situated in the universe of meaning. The human logos involving freedom, able to cohere with or argue with universal reason. In the words of Epictetus, it is not things in their materiality which trouble us, but the judgments we bring to bear upon things, that is the meaning we give them. This is the distinctive rationality of the human being, always involved in a discursively calculative exercise with regards to prediction of and accordance with nature or universal reason. On the practices of the Stoic schools, Hadot notes that they utilized dialectics, unlike the Epicurean. An auditor would propose a thesis. The teacher would then refute it by asking questions which gradually brought the interlocutor to admit the contradictory of the thesis. See here why Stoicism, its doctrine of nature as reason, the utilization of dialectics was so influential for Hegel in particular. So the Stoics, although they emphasized dogmatics, also practiced the dialectical method of question and answer in their instruction. Cicero, in fact, reproaches them for not leaving enough room for oratorical and rhetorical developments, which he viewed as the only thing capable of actually moving and persuading people. They prick you, as if with darts, with short, pointed questions. Those who answer affirmatively, however, are not transformed in their soul and go away as they had come. For although the thoughts which the Stoics express may be true and sublime, they do not treat them as they should, but do so in a rather dry manner. This is one of the few testimonies to exercises practiced in the Stoic school, and we're pretty in the dark as to the character of the schools during the period of the Middle Stoia. Know that the ancients admired them universally, presenting their doctrines in rigorously systematic logical sequences. At the same time, we know that they required their students to keep the school's essential dogmas present in their mind by dint of a constant effort of memory. The goal of the Stoic systems was to gather the fundamental dogmas together in condensed form and link them together with rigorous argumentation in order to form a systematic, highly concentrated nucleus, as did the Epicureans, sometimes reduced to one brief saying, which would thus have greater persuasive force and mnemonic efficacy. Hadot notes that above all, such sayings had a psychagogic value, a leading of the soul. On the Stoic theory of knowledge and morality, Hadot underlines that objectively and comprehensively, nature and fate are not moral phenomena. We must see things as they are, each event a link in the chain of necessity and reason. We are free to rail against nature and fate, but when we do so, we fall into error. Knowledge is thus acceptance and observation of the way things are by nature. There is no evil in nature itself, rather there is only moral evil. Its origin is thus traced to human choice. So in general, error and at the same time freedom is situated by the Stoics in the value judgments which we bring to bear upon events. The right moral attitude consists in recognizing as good or evil only that which is morally good or evil, and in considering as neither good nor bad, and therefore indifferent, that which is morally neither good nor bad. This implies that the only thing that depends on us is our moral intention, or the meaning we give to events. That which does not depend on us corresponds to the necessary linkage of cause and effect, in other words, fate, the course of nature, and the action of other human beings. So life and death, health and sickness, pleasure and suffering, beauty and ugliness, strength and weakness, wealth and poverty, nobility and baseness, political careers, all are indifferent because they do not depend on us as individuals making choices, but rather on the way that the world actually happens. For Hadot, this is a complete reversal of the usual way of looking at things. The Stoics moving from a human vision of reality in which our value judgments depend on social conventions and our passions, to a naturalized or physical vision of things which resituates each event within the perspective of nature and universal reason. Hadot asks how the Stoic can orient himself in life if everything outside of moral intention is indifferent. Will the Stoic marry, take part in politics, practice a trade, serve his country? This is where an essential part of Stoic moral doctrine steps in, the theory of duties, or of appropriate actions. This theory permits the beneficent will to find material on which it can practice, to be guided by a code of practical conduct, and to attribute a relative value to indifferent things, which in principle are without value. To find the basis for this theory of duties, the Stoic returns to their fundamental intuition, which is each living being's instinctive, original accord with itself from and by nature, which expresses the deepest will of nature in everything that lives. Here, human reason appears only when natural instinct becomes a more reflective, reasoned choice. Something is chosen because it responds to our natural tendencies, such as the love of life or of children, or love of one's fellow citizens, which is based on the instinct of sociability. To marry, to become politically active, to serve one's country, all these actions are appropriate to human nature and therefore have value, even if only a relative value, to human life and its flourishing. For what counts, after all, is not the result of our actions, for they are always uncertain, nor their effectiveness. Instead, what counts in the Stoic theory of duty is the intention of doing good. It will become, in Christian theology, the principle of synderesis, or conscience, and eventually the very basis of Kant's formulation of the good will underlying the formulation of the categorical imperative. Because the Stoic recognizes the limited perspective of human beings within universal nature, the Stoic always acts under reserve and tells himself, I want to do X if fate permits. However, if fate does not permit it, he will try to succeed in some other way, or else he will accept fate by willing what happens. Most unfortunately, we've lost the writings of Zeno and Chrysippus, and so have to rely, in understanding Stoic exercises, on authors like Cicero, quoted earlier, Philo of Alexandria, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. From all these sources, we can determine that logic in the Stoic teaching was not limited to an abstract theory of reasoning, nor even to school exercises in syllogistics, but rather the daily practice of logic was applied to everyday life. Logic was thus a mastery of inner discourse, or lived logic. The Stoics here sound a lot like proto-Vulcans in Star Trek. Indeed, the Stoics practiced a kind of Socratic intellectualism, wherein excessive human passions corresponded to misused discourse and to errors in judgment and reasoning. And thus Marcus Aurelius reminds us to meditate on realities and things more objectively. Writing, look at the object itself as it is in its essence, in its nudity, and tell yourself the name which is peculiar to it. In other words, observe reality minus value judgments inspired by convention, prejudice, or passion. Here Marcus Aurelius concludes comically, this imperial purple is sheepskin soaked in the blood of a shellfish, and sexual union is the rubbing together of abdomens with the spasmodic ejaculation of a sticky fluid. In fact, Stoic exercises like these underline the genesis of Sartre's vision of existentialism in its task of reducing our inherited assumptions regarding the essences and the functions of the world in order that we might again observe pure existence. Here, logical practice meets in the Stoics the domain of physics. Definitions such as these in Marcus Aurelius are formulated from the point of view of nature without any subjective or anthropomorphic considerations. This, of course, makes Stoicism a little less anthropomorphic than Epicureanism. Still imagines its God and God almost wholly on the model of the sage or the philosopher. In a way, the Stoics were more humble and put theory into practice only by recognizing oneself as merely part of the whole, only thereby to elevate oneself to a cosmic consciousness that is immersing oneself within the totality of the cosmos. The meditation on Stoic physics is to lead us to the perspective of universal reason, To achieve this, we must practice the imaginative exercise, which consists in seeing all human things from above. As we also hear in Aurelius, acquire a method for contemplating how all things transform themselves into one another. Concentrate your attention on this without ceasing, and exercise yourself on this point. Observe every object and imagine that it is dissolving and in full transformation. It is rotting and wasting away. In the last analysis for Hadot, Stoic physics is a spiritual exercise that leads the philosopher to give loving consent to the events that have been willed by that reason which is immanent to the cosmos. One of the best known Stoic spiritual practices was the pre-exercise or premeditatio of the evils that might occur, which Hadot glosses as an exercise which prepares us for facing trials. See this richly developed in Epictetus in a moment. We must not be afraid to think in advance about events which others might consider unfortunate. On the contrary, we are to think of them often in order to tell ourselves, above all, that future evils are not evils because they do not depend on us and do not pertain to morality. Stoic exercise was thus both lived logic and lived physics. Their fundamental attitude, that of continuous attention and vigilance exercised at every moment. Thanks to this attention, the philosopher is always perfectly aware not only of what he is doing, but also of what he is thinking, and this is the task of lived logic. And thus of what he is, in other words, of his place in the cosmos, i.e. lived physics. Stoicism is a lived philosophy whose exercise of wisdom is unique and complex. And the Stoics thus opposed purely theoretical philosophical discourse. They divided their system into logic, physics, and ethics as distinct parts. As in Epicurean thought, ethics was always primary. And the philosopher training for wisdom came to coincide with the unique act of universal reason. It is present in all things and in tune with itself. Let's turn now to some of the main doctrines in the textbook A Science section by Diogenes Laertius in his Lives and Opinions of the Eminent Philosophers, the section on Stoicism. Laertius is going to give us an overall account of the doctrines of Stoicism without paying too much attention to the major differences in some of the Stoic schools. I found it fascinating when I read that an animal's first impulse is to self-preservation because nature from the outset endears it to itself. As Chrysippus affirms in the first book of his work On Ends, his words are, "The dearest thing to every animal is its own constitution and its consciousness thereof." This will eventually morph into the principle of conatus in Baruch Spinoza, the tendency that each thing has to preserve itself in its very being. According to Chrysippus, animals repel all that is injurious, but give free access to all that is serviceable and akin to them. And as for the assertion that pleasure is the object to which the first impulse of animals is directed, it is shown by the Stoics to be false. For pleasure, if it is really felt, the Stoics declare to be a byproduct, which never comes until nature by itself has sought and found the means suitable to the animal's existence or constitution. In other words, pleasure is not but an aftermath, comparable to the condition of animals thriving or of plants in full bloom. I find this position to be quite compelling, although the skeptic in me is not quite sure if it's a decisive refutation of the Epicurean thesis regarding pleasure. It is certainly a valid rejoinder to that thesis and construction of an alternative picture of the world. Things by nature, endeared to themselves and persisting in their being, experience pleasure only as an afterimage of their thriving and bloom. Many psychological theories today would seem to accord more with this Stoic thesis than the Epicurean one. Diogenes goes on, "Nature, the Stoics say, made no difference originally between plants and animals, for she regulates the life of plants too, and in their case without impulse and sensation, just as also certain processes go on in us of a vegetative kind. But when, in the case of animals, impulse has been superadded, whereby they are enabled to go in quest of their proper aliment, for them, say the Stoics, nature's rule is to follow the direction of impulse. I.e., like in Epicurean physics, nature seems to adapt to itself in the Stoic system. On the beings we call rational, for them life, according to reason rightly, becomes the natural life. So it is in human nature to follow the dictates of reason, since reason is part of our nature, even if it is a more limited reason and not yet universal reason or logos itself. Logos supervenes to shape our impulses scientifically. And this is why Zeno was the first in his treatise on the nature of man to designate as the end goal or telos of every being to live in agreement with nature or live agreeably with nature, which is the same for us as the virtuous life, virtue being the goal towards which nature guides us. Next, we hear about the moral cosmic human and his theology. Living virtuously is living in accordance with the actual course of nature. For human beings, this means being rational beings. For our individual natures are part of the nature of the whole universe. And this is why the end may be defined as life in accordance with nature, or in other words, in accordance with our own human nature, as well as that of the universe, a life in which we refrain from every action forbidden by the law common to all things, that is to say, the right reason which pervades all things and is identical with this Zeus, the Lord and the ruler of all that is. Note the Stoic Zeus as well is transcendent, to some extent indifferent, being the ultimate instantiation of eternal reason, much like in Aristotle. Relationship to this supreme God can only ever be one of worship and at best imitation. And so the virtue of the happy man, the smooth current of life, is action which promotes the harmony of the spirit dwelling in the individual man with the will of him, Zeus, who orders the universe. We do not just imitate Zeus, his indifferent transcendence, but rather emulate the very will of Zeus, or the will of God. As to some of the key differences in the Stoic school, Diogenes notes that according to Chrysippus, the nature with which our lives must accord is both universal nature and the particular nature of the human being. According to Cleanthes, however, only the nature of the universe counts. We don't need to add the nature of the human being or the individual. So it seems that there were some serious debates within Stoicism as to how anthropocentric our Stoic philosophy should be. It seems to be a fairly minor difference, although I can see it might lead to some very major ones. Chrysippus Stoicism being perhaps to an emphasis on the human being, but perhaps the Stoicism of Cleanthes more emphasized our natural interdependencies within a cosmic ecology by the will of Zeus. In any case, for both, virtue is nature's harmonious disposition. It's choice-worthy for its own sake, not from hope or fear or any other external motive. For virtue is what makes the whole of life harmonious. Rationality, or phronesis, practical reason, is here prior to Sophia or theoretical contemplation. It cannot be perverted ultimately. Something incorruptible in the human being, its intention towards goodness and virtue. It can be taken offline, as it were, through self-deception and also through bad influences from others. At bottom, however, the starting points of nature as a whole and human nature are good. Virtue is the good of rational human beings in a threefold sense. 1. Virtue is the source from which all benefit results. 2. It is that in respect of which a benefit results, i.e. a good action. And 3. It is that by the agency of which the benefit results, i.e. the good man. The natural perfection of our natural being as humans is qua rationality. Diogenes lays out the Stoic doctrine of means and ends. Virtues are good both as ends and as means. So far as the virtues cause happiness, they are means. But insofar as they make happiness complete, they are ends. And similarly of evils, they can be both means and ends. Our enemy utilizes evil as a means, and the end he seeks is our consternation, abasement, slavery, gloom, despair, excessive grief, and every vicious action. Insofar as vices cause misery, they are also means. Insofar as our vices make our misery complete, they become ends, the ends of evil. Only the morally beautiful is actually good, and all goods are equal and all goods desirable. However, there are not only evil things and good things, but also indifferent things. Ultimately, good things include virtues like prudence, justice, courage, and temperance. Ultimately, evil things, vices like folly, injustice, or cruelty. However, a great many of the things in life are neutral or indifferent, such as life itself even. Fascinatingly, is not declared by the Stoics to be a good in itself, since it is determined by fate, and its absence is also willed by cosmic logos or nature. Similarly, things that we would think are good, such as health, pleasure, beauty, strength, wealth, fair fame, noble birth, are in fact neutral, and the sooner we learn this, the better for us in our path of according with nature. Similarly, we shun and eschew death, disease, pain, ugliness, weakness, poverty, ignominy, and low birth as unqualified evils. In fact, all these are simply by and from nature, neither good nor evil, but merely neutral. Benefiting ourselves, we set ourselves in motion and sustain ourselves in accordance with virtue, whereas harm is to set ourselves in motion and to sustain ourselves in accordance with vice. There are furthermore two types of indifferent things, those that might be preferred but are not necessary for happiness, such as good looks, and those which have no power of stirring inclination and might be either truly irrelevant or simply rejected. For example, wealth should have no power of stirring inclination and might be rejected, whereas whether a meal is served with ketchup or mustard, indeed has no power of stirring inclination and is truly irrelevant. Diogenes goes into much further detail on all things good, bad, and neutral or indifferent. The Stoic wise man we hear next is passionless, but the bad man is apathetic. The wise man is free from vanity and indifferent to good and evil report. The bad man might also be free from vanity, but in another sense, for he might lack shame and be sociopathic. All good men, according to the Stoic doctrine, are both austere and harsh, and this because they neither have dealings with pleasure themselves nor tolerate those who do. They sound a bit like party poopers and no fun. However, the Stoic wise man might, like Socrates, drink wine but not get drunk. The wise man does not feel grief because grief is irrational. The wise man is godlike and has something divine within him. The Stoic wise man is also an avid practitioner of traditional religion, for he does not ignore the divine like the bad man, but worships God, has knowledge of the rites of the gods, performs sacrifices, keeps himself pure, avoids impious acts, and the gods themselves think highly of wise men, for they are holy and just in all matters pertaining to the gods. You can see here why Stoicism was so much more popular among the pious Romans. Unlike Epicureanism, justified and lent its philosophical position to traditional religion. As we'll see in more detail when we study Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods next week. On the life according to wisdom, we next hear in Diogenes that affection for and friendship with the family is second only to affection for and friendship with the gods, so the gods have priority. Also that the wise will not take part in politics, but by his example restrain vice and promote virtue, nor will the wise adopt mere opinions. However, the wise will marry and beget children. The wise are free and the bad are slaves, since freedom is the independent action of thought. And all virtues are connected with phronesis, practical wisdom. Practice one virtue and it will lead you to them all. Unlike in Aristotle, however, virtue cannot always be learned. Some people just suck. And some Stoics argue that virtue can be lost, others that it can only become dormant. Ultimately, whether we are virtuous or vicious people is also from nature and must be accepted as fate, and is not just a matter of nurture or choice. Lastly, the Stoics are clearly in favor of Aristotle's third way of life, the rational, as the ground of a true ethics and to be preferred over the political life or the life devoted to pleasure. Fascinatingly, on sex and politics, the Stoics seem to have agreed more with Plato. We hear it is also their doctrine that among the wise there should be a community of wives with a free choice of partners. Under such circumstances, we shall feel paternal affection for all the children alike, and there will be an end of the jealousies arising from adultery. As to government, they teach that the best form of government is a mixture of democracy, kingship, and aristocracy, rather than democracy and oligarchy like in Aristotle. Having completed his overall account of Stoic ethics, Diogenes next turns to Stoic physical doctrine. Notice that their physics consists in 5 main subtopics: bodies, principles, elements, gods, and limits or space or the void. That it has 3 main themes of inquiry: the universe, the elements, and causation. The Stoic celestial inquiry or astronomy is distinguished from local physics, and the Stoics practice a kind of perspectival physics. They discuss the form and matter of celestial bodies, whether there is a beginning or not, whether the universe is animate or inanimate, destructible or indestructible, governed by providence or not, but always in a situated way from our own perspective. Way this keeps Stoic physics within human reason and does not purport, from that point of view, truly be able to grasp the physics of the all from our limited perspective. The study of causation or all relations of cause and effect is also various in Stoicism. There is medical inquiry, inquiry into the soul, growth and decay among natural beings, how vision is explained, mirror images, and the origin of clouds, thunder, rainbows, halos, comets. And lastly, Stoic scientific inquiry is in large measure interdisciplinary. So having defined bodies as universal reason or fire, undergoing constant transformation, or what Heraclitus called Zeus, Stoics discuss the 2 main principles as the active and the passive. The active principle is logos itself, which is inherent both in substance and in God or Zeus, and the passive is substance without quality or matter, what receives formation. These principles of active and passive are without generation or destruction, and are incorporeal but without form. Elements are destroyed when all things are resolved into fire. Elements have form. Their analysis of limits, space, or the void, the first principle is a line, or the extremity of a surface or length without breadth, as well as a point, which is the extremity of a line, the smallest possible mark or dot. Ultimately, God, the last principle, is one and the same with reason, fate, or Zeus, and he may also be called by many other names. Next in Laertius, we get a wonderful statement of the Stoic cosmology. In the beginning, God was by himself. He transformed the whole substance through air into water, and just as in animal generation, the seed has a moist vehicle, so in cosmic moisture, God, who is the seminal reason of the universe, remains behind in the moisture as such an agent, adapting matter to himself with a view to the next stage of creation. The upshot here is that fire and air are closer to the soul and to God, that is to reason itself, but also that God himself created the elements of earth and water, so as to unfold creation in successive stages. God, as fire and air or logos, is thus closest to active reason, and water and earth to passive matter or substance without quality. So we hear God created the four elements, which together constitute unqualified substance or matter. Note this is a return to Ionian physics over and against Aristotle. Fire has the uppermost place and is called ether, and in it the sphere of the fixed stars is first created. Only in the sphere of the planets, however, do we get air, water, and earth, earth being at the center of all things. This is a pretty marvelous doctrine because it's pretty much correct. Only in planets do we in fact have air, water, and earth. Stars themselves being fire and fixed in their courses in the cosmic ether. The term universe or cosmos has three senses. One, God himself, the whole of substance, the artificer of order, and the reabsorber of all things. We also speak of the cosmos in relationship to the orderly arrangement of the heavenly bodies in itself as such. And finally, we speak of the universe or cosmos as the whole of which these two are a part. Nature or physis is how we describe the cosmos as both God and the orderly arrangement of the cosmos. Opposed to the idea of infinite atoms and an infinite void, as well as an infinite plurality of worlds, Stoics propose that the world is one and finite and has a spherical shape, since this is the most suitable for motion. Outside the world is diffused the infinite void, which is incorporeal. The world of matter has a limit, beyond which there is infinite void, and thus the world has no empty space in it, but rather is a plenum and forms one united whole, moves through sympathy and tension and binds together all things in heaven and earth. Time as well is an incorporeal and the measure of the world's motion. For the Stoics, time past and time future are infinite, but time present is finite. The world has an end and a beginning, but only the parts of the world are perishable and undergoing constant transformation between beginning and end. The world began in cosmic fire and will end in cosmic fire, only then again to be reborn, the eternal return. In theology, we learn in Laertius, the deity is a living being, immortal, rational, perfect, or intelligent in happiness, admitting nothing evil, taking providential care of the world and all that there is, but he is not of human shape. He is, however, the artificer of the universe and, as it were, the father of all, both in general and in that which is called many names according to its various powers. This seems to be a Stoic principle of henotheism, all the various gods being attributes or names of the one God. The substance of God is the whole world and the heaven, we learn in both Zeno and Chrysippus. And the term nature is used to mean that which holds the world together and that which causes terrestrial things to spring up and grow. Nature is defined as force moving itself, producing and preserving in being its offspring in accordance with seminal principles within definite periods and affecting results homogeneous with their sources. And lastly, we learn in Laertius that nature aims at utility and at pleasure and can be thought on analogy to the human craftsman. So pleasure is one of the goals or aims of nature, not the source of judgment concerning moral goods and evils. All things happen by fate or destiny, fate being defined as an endless chain of causation, why things are, or as the reason and formula by which the world goes on. And on religion, the Stoics teach that divination in all its forms is real and a substantial fact, and that there really is a divine providence in the world, or matter or substance can be spoken of as universal or particular. Universal matter are the elements themselves which neither increase nor diminish. Particular matter or substances are the bodies, or in Epicurus, atomic aggregates, which do increase and diminish. Body is finite substance, and while bodies may be divisible in theory infinitely, in reality the division of matter never in fact goes on ad infinitum. Rather, the universals of nature carry on flowing, mixing, and separating all individual things, and the world is thus a mixture of the two substances, universal substance, the elements, and particular substance, the bodies, in an endless cosmic dance of recurrence. If a little drop of wine is thrown into the sea, it will be equally diffused over the whole sea and blended with it. And this is analogous to the situation of finite bodies in the universal cosmos. Now, as noted earlier, the Stoics, like the Epicureans, Cynics, and Skeptics, all sought serenity or ataraxia, meaning peace of mind, freedom from disturbance, through self-discipline. How they get ataraxia, however, is where they differ. For the Stoics, happiness, freedom from anxiety, comes about through detachment from all things external and outside one's control. The disciplined or reasonable person can be happy under any and all conditions because they learn to adapt to fate. And so for the Stoics, everything is a matter of our attitude, and nothing can make you happy or unhappy without your consent. On the fated life, the Stoics believe that the actual course of our world is directed by the Logos, which they thought of as world reason, cosmic mind, God, providence, and fate. And the Stoics learned, as many of us do, that our lives are not entirely our own. Rather than complain about what they could not control, the Stoics chose to master what they could, that is, their own minds. Serenity comes to those whose will is in accordance with world reason, the Logos, for it is only such thinking that leads to the reduction of frustration and anxiety. As Epictetus puts it, who we're turning to now, we are actors playing roles that we do not choose, and our duty is to play them as best we can, knowing that our fate is part of a much larger world order. Summing up Stoic theology, we can say it is a form of pantheistic henotheism. The will of God is in the form of nature is everywhere, but all the particular deities are ultimately the one deity of cosmic reason itself, Zeus. And like in Heraclitus, Zeus is immanent to the world and steers it with his will. And nature is thus permeated by destiny and divine providence, and everything is determined ultimately by divine reason. This principle of sufficient reason from Zeus is a cosmic truth which leads the Stoic to ethical acceptance. Whatever will be, will be. So again, Epictetus can write, "Do not seek to have events happen as you want them to, but instead want them to happen as they do happen, and your life will go well." Now, in the wake of the older and the middle Stoia, let's next turn to the Romans' great admiration of the Stoics. After Alexander's empire fell apart, the Romans quickly adopted Stoicism. One reason that Stoicism flourished in Rome may have been the admiration that the Stoics had for the Cynics, who the Romans also admired, who in a way morphed into the Stoics under conditions of empire. The cynical ideal of life, the sturdy character in the free open air, appealed to the later Stoics as well as to the Romans and bespoke a tradition of Socratic intellectualism, still deeper in its provenance and in its religious convictions than the refined philosophical systems of Plato and Aristotle, and also then the heretical spirit of Epicurus. Stoicism appealed to Romans living in times of great uncertainty under emperors of widely differing abilities and virtues, and its spread through the Roman world can be attributed to the fact that it was advocated early on by three important Roman public figures, namely Cicero, Cato, and Seneca. On life guided by Stoic philosophy, Seneca writes, "Philosophy is not a device for popular consumption or public display. It consists of real achievements, not mere words. We don't practice philosophy to round off the day with some amusement or to rid our spare time of boredom. Philosophy shapes and constructs the soul, orders our life, governs our actions, and shows us what is to be done and what avoided. It sits at the helm and directs our courage as we drift amidst a sea of doubt. Without philosophy, no one can live life with courage and free from anxiety. And every hour, countless things happen to us which need the guidance we must seek from philosophy." In answer to the classic objection, how can philosophy help me if fate exists? I.e., what is the good of my freedom in a hardly deterministic universe like that of the Stoics? Or of what avail is philosophy if God rules the universe? Or of what avail is it if chance governs everything? To which Seneca answers simply and elegantly, "It matters not whether fate binds us down by an inexorable law, or whether God as the arbiter of the universe has arranged everything as the Stoics teach. Whether chance drives and tosses human affairs without method, the doctrine of Epicurus, philosophy ought to be our defense in any case. For only philosophy will encourage us to obey God cheerfully, but fortune defiantly, and she will teach us to follow God and endure chance. What beautiful words from Seneca. Stoicism was so acceptable and popular among the Romans that in fact one of the greatest Roman emperors, Marcus Aurelius, was a major Stoic. His significant Plato's ambition of realizing a philosopher king ended up being realized only in Stoicism in the figure of Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest emperors of Rome, immediately before the period of its decline. By temperament, a scholar and a recluse, Aurelius lived surrounded by commotion, deception, crowds, and so told himself in his journal, known to us as the Meditations, to look within and only to attend to thyself. That is to the only thing that the Stoic can control. The last truly great figure of imperial Rome, Marcus Aurelius, was once described as by nature a saint and a sage, by profession a warrior and a ruler. That is, he was a Stoic philosopher king. Unfortunately, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius are not assigned in our textbook, although they're well worth reading for pleasure. Let's turn now to the last figure on the agenda this week, Epictetus and his handbook, or Enchiridion. Living in the generations before Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus was one of the most important Stoic philosophers and was also a former slave. Perhaps owing to his earlier life as a slave, he had insight into the biggest issues of Stoicism, controlling what we can and accepting what is beyond our control. As a slave, the only absolute control Epictetus has was over his reactions to what happened, and his motto is known as bear and forbear. Anechu kai apechu. Freed after Nero's death in 68 CE, Epictetus became a well-known teacher. By about 90 CE, all philosophers were ordered out of Rome by the Emperor Domitian, and so he fled to Nicopolis in Greece, where he founded a school and taught until he was very old. What he taught is that we must learn to accept fatalistically what we cannot change and strive to discover what we can about the nature of the universe so as to be able to predict how things will occur and rid ourselves of false opinions, which are the source of our irrational desires. All the other sources for Epicureanism and Stoicism we've studied this week are fascinating but quite difficult. However, reading Epictetus is accessible and students tend to love it, for the Enchiridion was written as a manual or handbook for everyday life, not intended as a document of great intellectual clout to be used in the debates among the various schools. Its teaching is of a purely practical import and universally helpful to every human being. And it begins from this core Stoic principle, to know the difference between what is in your control and what isn't, and what you can influence and what you can't. Even though the Stoics believed in destiny or fate, they also talked about choosing appropriate actions in addition to just controlling our attitudes. In fact, there appears to be a gap in our fate. There are things that we can have influence on. For example, you don't have absolute control over your grades, although you have considerable influence over them. Likewise, we do not control our destinies, but we do influence them, just enough that attaining equanimity or ataraxia is possible. According to Epictetus, not in our power and control are body, property, reputation, offices, in a word, whatever are not our own acts. By body here, Epictetus probably means both the body you are born into and the involuntary or unconscious vagaries of that body. That is, the aspects of the body not subject to human will, intention, or activity. By property in his context, he means primarily the estate into which you are born. Were you born a citizen with an inheritance, a free man or a slave? And he also means, even for that which is your property, natural disasters or wars might intervene. Whatever property you do have may be seized or destroyed. Also, you don't control your reputation. That is what other people say about you and how that affects your life, nor the offices you are assigned in society. Note how all these things not in our control, body, property, reputation, and offices, are nevertheless things we can have some influence on. We should not mistake this influence for control, because ultimately these features of life are not our own acts, not decided by us. Things in our control, according to Epictetus, include opinion, movement towards a thing, desire, and aversion. Again, even though these are all things we can control, there is a limit at which we can only speak of influencing them. Are you really in control of all your opinions, or is your way of life and seeing the world not determined to a large extent by inherited opinion, the vagaries of time and memory, and the power you exert, evaluating and perhaps changing your opinions? Ultimately, unlike your body, your opinions are something you have a large measure of control over. Perhaps, according to the Stoic doctrine, an almost total control should you choose to apply your reasoning faculties. Similarly, with movement towards a thing, that is locomotion, that's definitely something you control, except in perhaps in extreme cases of disability or of being constrained or restrained. Desire as well, to a large measure, within our control. This may not seem true in the case of being gripped by overwhelming desires by nature. For example, the pubescent adolescent wholly lacks control over their desires, wandering thoughts, and fantasies. Nevertheless, through virtuous choices, everyone can gain a measure of control over their desires and distinguish between those that are necessary for life and those towards which the appropriate attitude is indifference and suppression. And similarly for aversions, it may be natural to experience the emotion of disgust when, say, someone pukes at you randomly out of the blue. According to the Stoic way of thinking, you can control whether or not you flinch back in disgust, whether you see these events as natural like any others. Although opinion, movement, desire, and aversion are from and by nature, they are ultimately things that we have a much more extensive measure of control over, so long as we apply ourselves. Body, property, reputation, or offices. Here, the task in distinguishing what we can control and what we can't, and how we should influence both these things, Epictetus introduces his doctrine of appearances. Work, therefore, to be able to say to every harsh appearance, you are but an appearance and not absolutely the thing you appear to be. And then examine it by those rules which you have, and first and chiefly by this, whether it concerns the things which are in our control or those which are not, and if it concerns anything not in our control, be prepared to say that it is nothing to you. This Epictetean working on appearances appears to be the Stoic version of what we'll see next week as the skeptical epoché, or suspension of appearances. Common thread here being truly that appearances are not always what they appear to be. They do not provide in themselves, in their appearing, a maxim or a code of conduct. How we interpret and make meaning out of appearances and act accordingly is up to us, and based in knowing the difference between what we can control, what we can't, and how we can influence these things. Epicurus' Enchiridion, and held in the backpacks of Roman soldiers on long campaigns, could definitely be criticized as a somewhat overly manly philosophy of suck it up, man up. It has even been accused of a certain type of heartlessness. Indeed, Epictetus' statements on how we should relate to what we love as good Stoics can be either liberating or very disturbing. With regards to whatever objects give you delight, are useful, or are deeply loved, remember to tell yourself of what general nature they are, beginning from the most insignificant things. If, for example, you are fond of a specific ceramic cup, for example, this lovely little ceramic cup, which fueled the completion of my doctoral dissertation with a very large amount of espresso, features a delightful young German Mädchen riding in a chariot propelled by 2 horses. Remind yourself that it is only ceramic cups in general that you are fond of, so that if it breaks, you will not be disturbed. Thanks, Epictetus, that's a hard Stoic lesson, because indeed if this cup broke, I would be very disturbed. So far so good, but next Epictetus says that if you kiss your child and your wife, say that you only kiss things which are human, and thus you will not be disturbed if either one of them dies. Ouch. Beginning from the most insignificant things here, I can very much concur with Epictetus. It'd be pretty sad if my favorite ceramic cup broke, but I really shouldn't let it disturb my equanimity and peace. However, extending this to the most deeply loved and significant things such as wife and child, saying, well, I wouldn't be disturbed if they died, might be interpreted as a little cold-hearted. You must remember here how fragile life is, and especially how fragile it was during this period, where in fact it was routine to lose children to infant mortality, or to accident, to lose one's entire family, to natural disaster, or to enslavement through war. So these hard lessons from Epictetus do have a certain validity, even if they seem like a callous suppression of grief to the modern sensibilities. Death and responsibility, Epictetus writes, men are disturbed not by things, but by the principles and notions which they form concerning things. Death, for instance, is not terrible, else it would have appeared so to Socrates, but the terror consists in our notion of death that is terrible. When, therefore, we are hindered or disturbed or grieved, let us never attribute it to others but to ourselves, that is, to our own principles. An uninstructed person will lay the fault of his own bad condition upon others, and someone just starting instruction will lay the fault on himself. Who is perfectly instructed will place blame neither on others nor on himself. Again, whatever will be, will be. Our task in relationship to death, loss, grief, is simply to take responsibility for the life that remains, without misimagining the scope for which we in fact bear this responsibility. On life as an adventure, he invites us to understand ourselves as mariners on shore leave who went away from our ships for a bit to amuse ourselves picking shellfish or onion. However, this whole time, our attention was bent towards the ship, its time of departure. And when the captain calls us to get back on board, we must immediately leave all these pleasures and diversions. Otherwise, we might be caught by the captain, thrown into the ship, bound neck and feet like a sheep, or maybe even just left behind. So it is with life. If, instead of an onion or a shellfish, you are given a wife or child, that is fine. But if the captain calls, you must run to the ship, leaving them and regarding none of them. But if you are old, never go far from the ship, lest when you are called, you should be unable to come in time. Again, this does seem like a fairly heartless relationship to the wife and child and privileging of patriotism, the polis, social duty and responsibility, a world run and determined by men. The wisdom of the teaching is still apparent, but the form of its expression here certainly leaves something wanting. Following this maxim, one might very well abandon wife and child whenever duty or life's great adventure calls. And we hear yet more of the wife, the child, and the cup. Never say of anything, I have lost it, but I have returned it. Is your child dead? It is returned. Is your wife dead? She is returned. Is your estate taken away? Well, is it not likewise returned? But he who took it away is a bad man. What difference is it to you who the giver assigns to take it back? While he gives it to you to possess, take care of it, but don't view it as your own, just as travelers view a hotel. This saying in particular is heartbreaking. And again, the broken cup. The will of nature may be learned from those things in which we don't distinguish from each other. For example, when the neighbor boy breaks a cup or the like, we are presently ready to say, these things happen. Be assured then that when your own cup likewise is broken, you ought to be affected just as when another's cup was broken. Apply this in like manner to great things. Is the child or the wife dead? There is no one who would not say, this is a human accident. But if anyone's own child happens to die, it is presently, alas, how wretched I am. But it should be remembered how we are all affected in hearing the same thing concerning others. And here we find a beautiful Stoic principle of empathy, of ceasing to distinguish between one's own trials and tribulations and those of universal humanity. Here, rather than heartlessness, Epictetus recommends is empathetic equanimity. Indeed, it is better to mourn over the neighbor's wife, child, and cup than to be distraught on account of one's own. On not sweating the small stuff, Epictetus goes on, begin therefore from little things. Is a little oil spilt? A little wine stolen? Say to yourself, this is the price paid for apathy, for tranquility, and nothing is to be had for nothing. When you call your servant, it is possible that he may not come, or if he does, he may not do what you want. But he is by no means of such importance that it should be in his power to give you any disturbance. In other words, don't sweat the small stuff means don't stress out when you have a bad slave. If you wish your children and your wife and your friends to live forever, you are stupid. For if you wish to be in control of things which you cannot, you wish for things that belong to others to be yours. So likewise, if you wish your servant to be without fault, you are a fool, for you wish vice not to be vice, but something else. Again, we can sympathetically identify with much of Epictetus' sayings, but at the same time notice the very manly ethos and culture, especially in regards to what seems to be the orienting principle of many of these maxims, namely, that it is the men of the polis who own their women and slaves. On life as a symposium, he writes, remember that you must behave in life as at a dinner party. Is anything brought around to you? Put out your hand and take your share with moderation. Does it pass by you? Don't stop it. Is it not yet come? Don't stretch your desire towards it, but wait till it reaches you. Do this with regards to children, to wife, to public posts, to riches, and you will eventually be a worthy partner at the feast of the gods. And if you don't even take the things which are set before you, but are even able to reject them, then you will not only be a partner at the feast of the gods, but also of their divine empire. For by doing this, Diogenes, Heraclitus, and others like them deservedly became and were called divine. Here the emphasis in the motto on bear and forbear is on the forbearing. Don't be greedy at the party, and even better, be without need for it. Thus you will become like the greatest self-sufficient men of the past, Diogenes, Heraclitus, the most self-sufficient and thus the closest to the divine. And remember that you are an actor in a drama of such a kind as the author pleases to make it, if short, of a short one, if long, of a long one. If it is his pleasure that you should act a poor man, a cripple, a governor, or a private person, see that you act it naturally, for this is your business, to act well the character assigned to you. To choose your role is another's. Accounting for the other greatest reason why Stoicism was so appealing to the Romans, that is, alongside its manly ethos rooted in a kind of cynicism, is its strong emphasis on the validity of practices of piety and divination. Whoever is careful to regulate his desires and aversions as he ought, by the very same means is careful of piety likewise. But it is also incumbent on everyone to offer libations and sacrifices and first fruits conformably to the customs of his country, with purity and not in a slovenly manner, nor negligently, nor sparingly, nor beyond his ability. In other words, piety and its traditional performance are part of Stoic duty and required by nature. On the ethics of divination we hear, when you have recourse to divination, remember that you know not what the event will be, and you come to learn it of the diviner, but of what nature it is know before you come, at least if you are a philosopher. For if it is among things not in our control that you ask the diviner, it can by no means be either good or evil. Don't therefore bring either desire or aversion with you to the diviner, else you will approach him trembling. But first acquire a distinct knowledge that every event is indifferent and nothing to you, of whatever sort it may be. In other words, we should only really listen to the diviner when what they divine of concerns that which is in our control. If the question concerns something outside our control and the answer is unfavorable, we must not tremble or imagine that things could be otherwise. This would have been actually fairly good advice for the young king Oedipus when he first heard from the diviner about his tragic destiny. Come to divination as Socrates prescribed, in cases of which the whole consideration relates to the event, and in which no opportunities are afforded by reason or any other art to discover the thing proposed to be learned. When therefore it is our duty to share the danger of a friend or of our country, we ought not to consult the oracle whether we will share it with them or not. For though the diviner should forewarn you that the portents are unfavorable, this means no more than that either death or mutilation or exile is portended. So basically, if you know what you have to do by duty and it may be very dangerous, don't go to the diviner. Just do your duty. We have reason within us, and it directs us, even with these hazards, to the greater diviner, the Pythian god, who cast out of the temple the person who gave no assistance to his friend while another was murdering him. In other words, choose one's actions on the basis of duty and ethics, and of the deeper affinity of oneself with the divine as such. And don't let fear of what one is personally sacrificing get in the way, or allow divination to convince one a safer or less dutiful mode of action. On accepting our natures, we hear we should laugh, but not too much, avoid swearing, insofar as we are able, avoid public and vulgar entertainments, but if we can't resist them, avoid being corrupted, and try to avoid sex before marriage and adultery, but if you can't help yourself, be responsible about it. These and many other adages of this character, many concerned with bathing or in how sexy young women should comport themselves, make us wonder to what extent the popularity of Stoicism had to do, on some level, with the acceptance of a certain amount of vice, and perhaps aspects of the Enchiridion are indeed enabling. Nearing to the end of the texts, we hear now in a more principled form how ethics is prior to logic and metaphysics, where this principle is again brought under the sign of Socrates, who became perfect by improving himself and attending to nothing but reason. Though you are not yet a Socrates, you ought, however, to live as one desirous of becoming a Socrates. What would Socrates do? Being a basic principle of Stoic ethics. And here the first and most necessary topic in philosophy is that of the use of moral theorems, such as we ought not to lie, and the second is that of demonstrations, such as what is the origin of our obligation not to lie, and the third gives strength and articulation to the other two, what is the origin of this as a demonstration. We could see here that Stoic ethics does not have the same problem of a criterion. Moral principles are subject to demonstration and the demonstrations to demonstrations. When we get to this third level, we ask questions like what is demonstration, what is consequence, what is contradiction, what truth, what falsehood. And for Epictetus, all these are indeed answerable, unfold by rigorous dialectical necessity, from both the moral theorem and its demonstration. The task is simply to attend and be watchful in how the moral theorem, the demonstration, and the criterion for the demonstration are intrinsically related and unfold from each other. Furthermore, the most necessary aspect of moral theory is the theorem itself and practicing it. This is what you should employ all your diligence about. We should not spend all our time in abstract theoretical discussion, but rather focus on acting morally. And when we fail in this, we become hypocrites, arguing at length how lying is not right and nevertheless lying in the same breath. Epictetus closes his Enchiridion with a meditation on Zeus, necessity, and the will. Recommends 3 maxims that the Stoics should commit to heart. First, lead me, O Zeus, and lead me destiny, whither ordained is by your decree. I'll follow, doubting not, or if with will recreant I falter, I shall follow still. And the second maxim, from the tragic poet Euripides, who rightly with necessity complies in things divine, we count as skilled and wise. Euripides here clearly being admired by the Stoics. Lastly, from Plato's Crito, an apology, well, Crito, if this be the God's will, so be it, as well as Socrates on his accusers, Antius and Menoeceus have the power to put me to death, but not to harm me. And so that concludes this overview on Epicureanism and Stoicism, 2 very compelling philosophies indeed. And of course, there's much more. We've barely scratched the surface. Next week, we'll be covering cynicism, Pyrrhonian and academic skepticism, and the Hellenistic philosophy of religion in Cicero's treatise on the nature of the gods. This will give us one more opportunity to see how the Stoic, Epicurean, and skeptical position conceive of the divine, and how the debates between these various schools was framed around the time of Cicero. See you then, and have a good week.